Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session in UDO University. Today, we're going to talk about stormwater standards in the UDO. I'm Nan Peterson. I'm with the Planning Department. I will do the introductory slides and then turn it over to our friends and teammates in the stormwater team. So, Brendan, whenever you're ready, you can go to the next slide. Again, I hate to be repetitive, but we do have some new folks in for this presentation. So we're just briefly going to go over some of our meeting protocols. The Charlotte Development Center will narrate these presentations, and today's presenters are representatives of City of Charlotte's Stormwater Services and our Mecklenburg County LUISA. Please enter any comments or questions in the chat. We are going to be answering these at the end of the session, and if time allows, we'll answer any additional questions through chat. If there's a lot of questions and we don't have an opportunity to answer them today, we will provide an answer and send it out to all those who have registered for this session. Also, to be fair and equitable to all, staff will not unmute participants to ask a question or comment. And if a question cannot be answered, we will so note it and we will send out a response in the next few days. The mission statement for the UDO University is our purpose of the university is to acquaint attendees with the City of Charlotte's requirements and processes affiliated with the currently adopted Unified Development Ordinance, as we call it, the UDO. Comments made at the UDO University sessions are intended to provide guidance and are non-binding on the formal review of the development plans. Again, we had 10 sessions. Registration is required for each session. Registration is available at our charlotteudo.org site. All the sessions are on Fridays from 1 to 2:30, and they're all available via Zoom, as we are seeing today. They are recorded and posted on the Charlotte UDO website. Again, we are facilitated by various agencies in the Charlotte Development Center, and each session will be built upon information provided in previous sessions. Reminder, all sessions again are recorded and can be found at our website. So our purpose for today is to provide an overview of changes and updates to existing and proposed stormwater articles. These articles include Article 23, the water supply watershed protection, Article 24, drainage, Article 25, post-construction stormwater regulations, Article 26, surface water improvement and management, swim buffers, Article 27, floodplain regulations, and Article 28, soil erosion and sediment control. And to answer any questions about these stormwater articles. Our presenters today are Gurveer Apal, City of Charlotte Stormwater Services, Robbie Zink with Stormwater, Jordan Miller, Stormwater, David Good with LUISA with Mecklenburg County, and Jay Wilson also with City Stormwater. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gurveer to talk about the UDO Article 23, the water supply watershed updates.
Thanks, Nan. I'll start with the water supply watershed updates. So the first key change here is we're moving from Chapter 10 of the City Code to Article 23 of the UDO. Variances will be reviewed by the UDO board instead of the ZBA. Then here we just have a picture of the water supply watersheds. You have your Lake Norman, you have your Lake Wylie, your lower Lake Wylie, your Mountain Island Lake, and those are also broken out into your critical areas and protected areas. And then here, so we have this information is currently online, but we don't have it in this table format. So we are going to be putting that into a table to kind of make it a little bit easier to find that information. So here you have your Mountain Island Lake watershed, you have your low density options for your critical areas and your protected areas. You'll see there's no high density option there. So everything will remain low density. And then same for the built upon area, that you don't have that for, you don't have an option for non-residential in the critical areas, but you do in the protected areas. And then set same table again. This one's just for that Lake Wiley watershed. You have your high density option and your low density option for each of the critical areas and protected areas. And then once more, this is just that same table for the lower Lake Wiley watershed. Once again, you have your low density option and your high density option for your critical area and protected area for both residential and non-residential development. And here we have your buffer requirements for your Mountain Island Lake watershed. See, your critical area always has that 100-foot buffer. And then you also have your, and then you also have your FEMA flood fringe areas. So for the critical area, your buffer becomes whichever one's greater, the 100-foot or that FEMA flood fringe. And your protected area is set with that 50-foot buffer and 100-foot buffer for both options. Below that, you have your Lake Wiley watershed buffer requirements for both your critical area and protected area, and those two same options for the high density and low density. And then I'll turn it over to Robbie for drainage.
Thank you, Gurveer. So for those that have, we should probably set this disclaimer at the beginning. For those that went to the city county workshop a few weeks ago, y'all can probably either do some other work or take a nap for a little bit, because a lot of this is the same information we shared at that time. So this Article 24 is the drainage article. It's a new article. There's no real requirements in any ordinance per se that currently with this, so it's all new. The applicability applies to any, or the construction of any new structure, driveway, streets, or parking lot, or the installation or modification to a city's drainage system, or land disturbances that modify or impact existing drainage features. The intent of this article mainly is for residential infill that the city is seeing a increase in over the last few years, and has created numerous issues for stormwater and for adjacent property owners. So going along with that, why do we create the article? It is modifications being made to the system, which we aren't aware of, structures within our easements, substandard drainage being installed, properties putting in flood prone areas, and adjacent property flooding, and driveway conflicts, and then developing in areas with known drainage issues. Okay. So next we'll go through a few examples of things that have occurred within the city that have created some issues for stormwater. And these are the things that we're trying to prevent with this new article. In this situation, you can see in the top picture some existing single family houses that were torn down, rebuilt with large duplexes. On the left-hand side, you can't see, but there's a stream right next to this. Modifications were made to a gabion wall, increased the height of that, which creates some stormwater issues. And then the other issue is this is right near a low spot since it's near a creek, and the driveway doesn't take much for water to overtop that driveway and flow down into the garage and to the living space. Next. Another single family redevelopment. The left-hand side is kind of a before picture where, and the bottom left is actually during construction. There was a drop inlet in this yard. The house was rebuilt. The yard was raised up, and there's a drop inlet. You can barely see it in the kind of back part of the picture. It was raised to And on the right-hand side is bottom right, you can see after it's built and the fence, and there was no way for the water to drain out. Sorry. Next. This example is of a porch or expansion to an existing house, and it was built over the top of a 24-inch pipe that actually had an easement on it. That pipe is about 7.5 feet deep. So as you can imagine, any issues with that, or, maintenance of that is impossible. All right, this last, I think it's the last example, is another some tear down rebuilds, putting in 4 lots where there used to be 3 parcels. The bottom left screen or picture, you can see where the houses were built. The grade was raised. They installed pipe. The pipe was undersized. They installed HDPE, which if constructed properly, it is okay. But we've found that that's rarely the case, that it's rarely installed properly. So there are always numerous issues with it if it's not done correctly. In this case, that unit on the right, the house, had about 3 feet of water in it in the first significant rain. So next. So the kind of process we're envisioning to comply with this is a concurrent review with the building permit process at the county. Approval of this permit would be required with the building permit, and review of the stormwater is sorted into 3 tiers. And for those of you that listened to the urban forestry or tree presentation a few weeks ago, we do plan on doing kind of a concurrent review with them, since they will be looking at very similar things. So back to the tier issues, our tier document we're kind of creating is a tier 1 review is minimal or no impacts to existing drainage systems. So no steel drawings or design would be required. And then here's some general plan requirements of just site plans to scale and some proposed grading if you are grading, proposed built upon area, and existing and proposed infrastructure on the site and dimensions from that infrastructure. Next. This is just an example I quickly drew up a while back of a 15 by 15 addition on the back of a house. The red line, kind of the bottom part, is showing an existing pipe, and just dimensioning from that. As you can see, we're like 20 feet away from that pipe. So we believe there's no issue here. And so that would be a quick approval. Tier 2 is where new infrastructure or modifications to existing infrastructure would apply. These would need to be sealed by appropriate design professionals with existing and proposed detailed grading. And the drainage plan would need to show existing and proposed easements and any supporting calculations. And the review will verify this proposed drainage plan meets all design standards. And any easements must be recorded with the Register of Deeds. Another same site, different example of a 20 by 30 garage. This is closer to that pipe, or it was actually over the top of the existing pipe, so it would need to be relocated. As you can see in this picture, we did draw a driveway over the top of the pipe. That would be okay, so we're not preventing that. Next. Tier 3 is for where you would find flood study requirements and or post-construction stormwater requirements that Jordan will address further in the presentation. So this would include tier 1 and tier 2 plan and calculation requirements, plus flood study if it's required, which would be required if the flow is greater than 50 CFS in the 100-year storm. And it would also have to show any post-construction stormwater compliance using our BMP manual. Plats would be required to record the easements and any stormwater protection elevations and stormwater elevation lines. Right, this example is of a new home adjacent to a creek, which does get more than 50 CFS. In the 100-year storm, flood study would be required and would possibly have post-construction stormwater requirements. Okay. Next, we'll go to Jordan Miller with the post-construction changes.
All right, thanks, Robbie. So a little bit of background. I know a lot of folks probably already know this, but the city's post-construction stormwater ordinance is required. All basically large municipalities have to have something to regulate flow and pollution from sites after construction. So this is a requirement of our the city's NPDES permit. Go ahead, Brendan. Overview and purpose, none of this changes. It's an existing ordinance. We want to minimize impacts to downstream properties from both a flooding and pollution perspective. So we want to improve surface water quality and minimize damage to infrastructure and property. Key term, just for folks that will probably come up several times, built upon area is impervious or partially impervious materials, and that includes gravel, rooftops, those types of things. Go ahead. So current requirements for post-construction that reside in Chapter 18 of City Code, stream buffers vary from 30 to 200 feet, and that is dependent on location and drainage area to the stream. There's a lot of functions of the buffer that are listed here, but essentially protect habitat and improve water quality within a riparian corridor around creeks within Charlotte. And these are required on all intermittent or perennial streams, as determined locally by a qualified professional. Next. Currently, we have a natural area requirement in post-construction. It's essentially a percentage of the site depending on the development type and density that can be provided in several locations on the site. But it's just a preserved area to remain natural or reforested. Next. And then the sort of biggest section of post-construction are the structural controls that are required. And so these would be to provide detention and prevent downstream flooding, as well as the water quality piece. And so we have several storms that must be detained to prevent downstream flooding and erosion. And then we also have pollutant removal required within these stormwater control measures, or stormwater BMPs, as they were previously called. And some of the pollutant removal requirements are dependent on watershed. So there's 3 different watershed districts within the city's jurisdiction. And so depending on where you are, you may have a slightly different requirement, but those are all listed within current and proposed ordinance. Next. So most importantly, that was just a little background. What's changing is this moves from Chapter 18 to Article 25 in the adopted UDO. There are revised thresholds for compliance of what triggers a post-construction review and approval. And then we did also look to just align some requirements across some of our older ordinances and remove some older exemptions. Post-construction was originally adopted in 2008. And so a couple of the exemptions no longer apply. So we removed those just for ease of readability. Next. Go ahead. Next, Brennan.
I'm trying. Hold on.
Oh, you're good. All right, thanks. So this is just a summary of changes, and obviously this will be made available so you can look at these references more closely. Obviously, if you have questions, let us know. But probably the biggest change is that currently the applicability triggers are based on the use of the development type, whether it be residential or non-residential. And so we're shifting to just have everybody have the same trigger. So commercial was 20,000 square feet and residential was 24% of built upon area. And so now everyone will have a 5,000 square foot of new built upon area that would include removed and replaced built upon area. And so that'll be consistent, and the existing 1 acre disturbance threshold remains, and it isn't either or, just like it is today. So it's either 5,000 square feet of new BUA or 1 acre disturbance triggers complying with the ordinance. And the reference to the new article sections there on the right. This is a mostly on paper change. The next one, state law prohibited requiring stormwater controls, increased stormwater controls on redeveloped built upon area, the built upon area that was removed and replaced back in 2018. And so by policy, we've met that law, but we need to update our ordinance to reflect that. So those sections are referenced, but nothing's actually changing from what's been done over the past 4 years. But it's just now it's codified. And then the preservation or revegetation of natural areas currently required is no longer within the post-construction regulations. Any tree related, tree save type requirements would be in Article 20 in tree protection that I believe there's already been a UDO session on. Next. And then another change is that we currently have 4 mitigation options available to redevelopment and development. And those range from doing some limited on-site controls to some payment and mitigation fees. Those are no longer allowed and are not included in the adopted UDO. So there's a reference there, but essentially you just won't see them in 25.5. But the old sections are listed from the current ordinance. And then another change is that currently industrially zoned properties do not have to meet the exact same requirements that all other development types do. And so that was removed, and all development types to meet the same requirements when it comes to on-site stormwater controls. So the references there are both for existing current, where you might see that flagged, and new, where it would not include that exemption. And then the last one there on the screen is we've had a zoning ordinance detention requirement since the late 70s. And so we've rolled that requirement into this section of the UDO. So you don't have to kind of bounce around to a couple different places. So you'll see that reference in Article 25 as it relates to requiring detention on certain sites. Next. And I believe these are the last two. So the city currently can accept maintenance of SEMs or BMPs within single family developments after a 2-year sort of warranty period, where they would maintain it and then potentially hand over some of that responsibility to the city. That is not included in the UDO. So SEMs on private property would be maintained by the property owner or HOA or whoever owns the property. The reference for that is shown. And then the other change is that we have had water quality buffers within the city for many, many years, and mitigation has been allowed for most of them. So the change here is that any placement of built upon area within these buffers associated with this article within 15 feet would not be allowed. So you'd have to keep the built upon area out of the 15 feet. Impacts could still be allowed, but they couldn't be for the placement of built upon area. And those sections are referenced there as well. I believe that might be it next. Oh, sorry, a couple more. So a couple exemptions just to sort of flag for folks who might not be as familiar with this ordinance. Following are exempt if approved prior to July 1, 2008. That's the current date for post-construction, so that carries over in the UDO. And essentially it'd just be a plan submitted for approval or somehow still valid approval and unexpired. So if there was a plan that was either still valid by way of some very long amount of resubmittals, or some sort of ongoing construction that was still valid, it would remain exempt if that occurred prior to that date. Or if you had a preliminary subdivision plan that was still valid when it comes to non-residential. And then the common law vested right is a typical exemption for most municipalities when it comes to stormwater regulations. So that remains, and that's somewhat a little bit of a case by case. As you can see there, it's dependent on what occurred on the site and at what time. Next. And then one sort of maybe now it's less confusing exemption is that we've had an exemption for conditional zoning districts that were approved prior to the July 1st, 2008 date. There were some sunset dates when you had to submit plans, but those have all since passed for many years. So we removed that language. And now it's just if you have a initial rezoning that was approved prior to that date and has been built out 22.5% prior to that date on the screen and meets a couple little extra requirements there, as you can see, then they would continue to be exempt from this new version of post-construction, just as they were from the current post-construction ordinance. And then the last one, I'm mainly just flagging what I talked about a minute ago with the built upon area or disturbance. That it is an and, so you have to both be under 5,000 square feet of the built upon area and disturb less than 1 acre in order to be exempt. If you hit either one, then you do have to show compliance with the ordinance or the article. And these are 2 other existing exemptions that rolled over. You have a lot in the city's jurisdiction that was recorded prior to July 1st, 2008, and it is less than 20,000 square feet in size, then it is exempt from this article, just as it would be in the current ordinance. One very important caveat there is that it is if you are developing only that lot. If there's any sort of part of a larger common plan of development, which generally means if it's, well, there's a definition in the article. I won't read word for word, but if it gets combined in any way with another lot, then that exemption would not apply. So that should be one lot recorded prior to 2008, less than 20,000 square feet. And the last exemption is very uncommon, but it's required to be in there. And essentially, if you were having to meet a requirement from one of those sections there, then the work associated with that would not somehow trigger this requirement. And I don't know of an actual ongoing farming or forestry activity that's occurred in the city that's met this, but that remains in the ordinance as well. And I'll kick it back over to Gavir.
Thanks, Jordan. And then I'll go into surface water improvement and management buffers, your swim buffers. And we did touch on some of this. So some of this information was just in that previous PCSO portion. Well, we have our environmental report card shows that many of our streams in the Charlotte area are not swimmable or fishable. So we are working to reverse that or reduce the amount of pollution in the streams. And that's where the buffers come into play. And these are a requirement as part of the post-construction stormwater ordinance. And then, yeah, Jordan went over these, just the importance of the water quality buffers to protect the water quality by filtering pollutants in the stormwater runoff, provides that storage for floodwaters, provides habitat for wildlife, and provides soil stability through root mass. Those are the key ones. And then here you just have a picture of those different watersheds. Each one of these has different PCSO requirements, and that's where you might see those different high to low density numbers that impact the buffer width. And then once again, we just have a picture of those buffers, and those vary in width from 30 to 200 feet, depending on the watershed. And then the key change here is moving from Chapter 12 of the City Code to Article 26 of the UDO. Basically, the swim has been in effect since 1999. This applies to all intermittent and perennial streams that drain at least 100 acres. Once again, those widths vary from 35 to 100 feet. And if no buffer is required, we do recommend that you maintain a 10-foot undisturbed vegetative buffer measured from the top of the bank on each side of the stream. And then streams that are to be piped in must get approval from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and NCDEQ. And then if you are piping that stream in, you are required to mitigate for the buffer that will be going away. And you go to the next slide. Then here we just kind of, same thing as before, we just kind of put those numbers into a table to help identify basically your buffer widths for each region or each stream size. You can see you have 4 streams draining greater than 100 acres. You have your stream side zone, your managed use zone, and your upland zone, and then the total buffer width. For those streams draining between 300 and 640 acres, you have that middle row with your 20-foot, 20-foot, 10-foot, giving you that 50-foot width on the buffer. For those streams draining greater than 640 acres, you have that 30-foot stream side zone, that 45-foot managed use zone, and then your upland zone will be either 25 feet or it's going to be that 50% of the area of the FEMA flood fringe beyond 100 feet. And then you'll be able to see on the next slide here, we added a little graphic to help you kind of determine that width. So, and that first one on the left side, if your 100-foot swim buffer is closer to the top of the bank, your 50% area will be measured from the area between the FEMA flood fringe and the encroachment line. If your community encroachment line is closer to the top of bank than the 100-foot swim, then you'll take 50% of the area between the FEMA flood fringe and the 100-foot swim. And here we just have an updated graphic showing those 3 zones, your stream side zone, managed use zone, and your upland zone. And here, this is currently in the buffer implementation guidelines. We're just updating that table. Just shows the function, the targets, and the impacts of each of those zones for your stream side zone, your managed use zone, and your upland zone. The most restrictive is going to be that stream side zone, where you get a little bit more allowed will be that managed use zone, and that upland zone for the most part can be impacted in all situations. And you go to the next, and then next, I'll turn it over to David for floodplain regulation.
Good afternoon. I'm going to discuss an overview. I'll give you an overview on floodplain regulation in Mecklenburg County. I'm the floodplain administrator for the city of Charlotte and all 6 towns. And there's a fairly consistent regulatory scheme work over the entire county. Even though the city and the rest of the towns have individual floodplain ordinances, we're trying to be consistent. But for those of you that don't work in this area, the purpose of the floodplain regulations is to reduce impacts to people and property from flooding during a major storm events. Another purpose of the floodplain regulations is you have to have a floodplain ordinance in place in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So for insurance to be issued, flood insurance to be issued in Mecklenburg County, we have to have a floodplain ordinance and with minimum standards. So these standards are national standards across the, this is a federal regulation. These are national standards. And you have to meet these minimum standards in order to issue flood insurance. Another aspect of the city of Charlotte's flood insurance flood ordinance is that we go above the minimum standards. So we have certain higher standards that we regulate to. The floodplain ordinance only applies to very large streams like Little Show Creek, Briar Creek, Long Creek are examples, because the floodplain, the regulatory floodplain doesn't begin until there's at least a square mile of drainage area drained to that stream. And what you see on your screen is a snapshot from a flood insurance rate map. And that shows the area that's regulated by the floodplain ordinance. So the blue area shown on the map, if you were to do any type of construction in that area, any of the different types, residential, commercial, industrial, utility construction, any kind of construction in that area, these regulations would apply. Next slide. Now I'm just going to generally talk about some changes that were made prior to the adoption of the UDO, and then I'll talk about some individual changes that are included in the UDO adoption. If you do work in this area, then you're probably familiar that last year on January the 1st, we made some revisions to the previous ordinance because we need to get some stuff done based on we had some issues that needed to go ahead of the UDO because they were becoming important and critical. One of these issues was the North Carolina Department of Emergency Management creates a state model floodplain ordinance, and they update this ordinance every so often. And in order to participate in the NFIP, you have to conform with that ordinance. So we had some changes that we need to make so that our current ordinance back in January of last year would be compliant with the state requirements. The second issue that we were dealing with a year ago was in Mecklenburg County, and all these streams, we regulate with what's known as the future conditions floodplain. And so the way that we determine the future conditions floodplain is we estimate the storm height for a 100-year storm as if the watershed upstream of some point in that water along that stream has been fully built out. So the theory is that this would be the highest estimated flood elevation that we would have in the future. And so we've used this standard since 2004. That's how we regulate. And since 2004, we have updated maps in these watersheds, and we discovered that there was some variability in the way that we calculated future conditions floodplain. So in order to correct that, we had engineers give us some advice and make recommendations on how we can get more consistent results. And what they also discovered is that our future conditions floodplain is about 0.8 of a foot low. So in order to, so what we did is we added another foot to what we call the flood protection elevation. So the way these regulations work, if you were to build a house, for instance, in a floodplain, your lowest floor in your house would have to be above the flood protection elevation. And before this change, the flood protection elevation was the future flood elevation plus the foot. So what we did is we added another foot to that future conditions floodplain elevation because we're compensating for the fact that we believe that in general, that floodplain is about a foot low. And so we went ahead and made these changes because if we didn't, then if a house was built in the future, it may be non-compliant. So we had to get this in before the UDO. We also made a couple of changes having to do with parking and dryland access because we regulate parking in the floodplain, and the dryland access is just access from a road to the building. And we were getting some variances requests on these two provisions, 4 or 5 a year. And usually we worked it out and we added conditions to the variance. We would work out a negotiated settlement to the variance. We would add conditions. And so what we did is we just incorporated those conditions into the ordinance so we eliminate those variance requests. The last thing that we adopted a year ago was in the past, previously, when FEMA, we update our maps every few years. And every time we did that, we work with FEMA. We actually do our mapping, but FEMA has to approve the mapping. And once FEMA approved the mapping, we would have to go to city council and ask city council to adopt the maps. We had a provision in the ordinance, so as soon as FEMA issues maps, they're automatically adopted. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the UDO specific changes that we made. And the main, for the floodplain ordinance, there wasn't many really detailed changes in the UDO. The main change is we used to have an ordinance that was standalone, all in one place. And now the ordinance is divided into two different articles. The meat of the floodplain ordinance, all the specific standards are located in Article 27 of the UDO, and the enforcement provisions have been separated out to Article 39. Enforcement provisions are like notices of violation, correction actions, penalties, that sort of thing. So for folks that are used to working in the floodplain area, they'll have to look in two separate paces, but that's the main change. Another change that will be adopted under the UDO is, and we've always, these last three changes or many of these changes that I'm discussing are just codifications of the way we normally do business. And this is one of them. Under the federal regulations, you are allowed to notify an insurance company or a lender if the owner of a building in the floodplain has a violation. So in other words, that building is non-compliant with federal regulations and the ordinance. And so if there was a flood and the building is subject to a notice of violation, then insurance companies will not pay for the damages and lenders. So we've always had, it's always been federal policy that you could notify the insurance company that there's a notice of violation on this building. And so this just codifies that policy in the ordinance. The next change we made is there's a concept in the floodplain ordinance called substantial damage. So if you have a building and the finished floor of the lowest finished floor of that building is below the flood protection elevation, so in theory, that would flood during one of these large storm events, then that building is considered non-compliant. And so when it's non-compliant, if there's a storm that impacts that building and floods that building, and that storm causes damage that's more than 50% of the value of the building, then you have to bring that building into compliance with the current floodplain ordinance. This has been the rule since the beginning of our floodplain regulation, and it's a federal rule, it's FEMA rule. What this change allows us to do is to file the notice that the building has been substantially damaged with the Register of Deeds. So if any purchaser of that building would know that they would, they buy this building, they're going to have to bring it into compliance with floodplain ordinance. Okay, the three last items were just changes to definitions. We clarified the definition of a basement, and that's significant in the floodplain world because basements are treated differently for floodplain and flood insurance purposes. So we made some adjustments to the definition. We also made some adjustments to clarify the definition that lowest floor I was talking about, because the lowest floor has to be above the flood protection elevation. So there has been some discussions over the years about what exactly does that mean? What's the lowest floor? So we added some more language to that definition. And the last change that we made just codifies an existing policy. We do business this way, but we wanted to add a provision in the ordinance that would specify that we require non-conversion agreements. Next slide. And here is an example of what a non-conversion agreement is. in this picture, you're looking at a building that's in the floodplain. And in this building, the lowest floor from floodplain point of view is that upper floor. And it is elevated, that upper finished floor is elevated above the flood protection elevation. But the lower area, which is a garage, so the lower enclosed area is a garage, it's below the flood protection elevation. So you're not allowed to go in, and you have to, in areas that are below, enclosed areas that are below the flood protection area, flood protection elevation, parking, storage, and access are allowed. Can't have living space. You have to build with only flood resistant materials. You have to have all the electrical and any HVAC has to be protected against flood damage. And you also have to have flood vents in an enclosed area. The flood vents, if you look at this picture down near the grade, the final grade, you'll see 3 silver looking boxes in the foundation. Those are flood vents. So that allows the water to enter that area when it floods and exit that area when the flood recedes. And the flood elevation on this building is, just to give you an idea, is somewhere up around probably the middle of those windows that you're looking at on the side. And so the issues that we've had in the past, and this is across the country, is the contractor comes in, builds this house, sells it to the first buyer. They sell it to the second buyer, and after a few buyers down the chain, folks don't really understand why it's built this way. So if you went in and closed up those areas and finished it, then it's a non-compliant house because the lowest floor becomes that basement. And so when we had a flood in that basement, it would get severely damaged. Even if you plug up those, even if you remove the flood vents and that sort of thing, chances are it's going to flood, it's going to cause damage, and also it's non-compliant. So if that were to happen, the flood insurance would not pay for the damages in the bottom. And you'd have to rip out the sheetrock, the insulation, all that. They're not going to pay for the damage. So what we're trying to do, so this provision allows us to file the non-conversion agreement, which states from the beginning that this area can't be converted to living space. File it with the registry of deeds. So somewhere down the line, maybe the buyer would get notice that they can't convert this lower level. If they do, they would be in violation and possibly not recover their flood damage on a flood damage claim. That's the most significant, I guess, change in the UDO, but it just codifies what we're already doing. Next.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be handling the last section here, Article 28, the Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control Ordinance. Before we get started, I'll just say that a lot of the changes to existing Chapter 17, future Article 28, are to reflect changes and updates to state law. So there aren't any, I think, big changes in store that were UDO inspired, but I'll kind of try to point some of those out as we go on. Just briefly, for those of you who aren't aware, the erosion control program or construction site stormwater controls are a requirement of the city's NPDES permit. Just as construction sites have to have permits to discharge their waters to the waters of their effluent to the waters of the state, so do municipalities and cities. And as a requirement of the city's permit, a delegated authority or erosion control program is required. The city's ordinance has traditionally been more stringent than the state law, and I think we retain a lot of those protective features that are needed in a growing and high density urban area like Charlotte is and is becoming more of. Next slide, please. So just briefly, the overview and purpose, the idea is that we protect, maintain, and enhance public health, safety, and environment by minimizing impacts from erosion and sedimentation during active construction. And so, primarily that objective is to protect surface water quality. We protect private property and infrastructure, but really a lot of this is coming from the place of protecting surface water quality and minimizing damages to streams, creeks, water features of all types, and then of course infrastructure and property along with that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go over some of the current requirements of the ordinance, and this is really more of a review for folks that may not be aware of what the erosion control ordinance is responsible for and the things we're trying to accomplish. And these aren't all the requirements. These are most of the requirements, at least broadly speaking. We'll kind of go through some of these. But briefly, all land disturbing activities, anytime the surface of the earth is disturbed or altered, those activities must provide adequate control measures. And if you are participating in a land disturbing activity that disturbs 1 acre or more, those protective measures must be ensured with an approved soil erosion and sedimentation control plan prior to beginning the project. The ordinance goes on to outline some control objectives. We do things like identify critical areas, limit time of exposure, limit exposed area, control clean water that originates upstream of the site, and of course control sedimentation and the damaging velocity at the outfalls. Next slide. Other requirements and notable requirements are for slope stability and ground cover and vegetation. So there's the two troublesome areas during land disturbing activities that the ordinance helps us protect against negative impacts with. So the current requirements also require that site operators monitor and maintain their active construction sites. The ordinance states that persons conducting land disturbing activities must inspect their measures at regular intervals to ensure adequate performance. And this is an area where our ordinance has traditionally been more stringent than state standards and continues to be so. And then the maintenance requirement is such that when measures are not performing at their design efficiency or optimal efficiency, that the site operators must take action to correct those deficiencies so that they function as designed. Next slide, please. Some of the changes I've mentioned already. We're moving from Chapter 17 of this Code of City Ordinances to Article 28 of the UDO. The meat of the ordinance will be in Article 28 now, and really the vast majority of the changes that were made that you will see in the UDO as compared to Chapter 17 are to reflect changes in state law since the last ordinance update. For those of you who've been plugged into this process, you understand that UDO has been going on for a few years. We've known this was in the works even before, and we had been trying to be efficient with our request to council for updates to the ordinance, and we had decided to roll these state required changes in with the UDO. And so the vast majority of the changes that we made to the soil erosion and sedimentation control section are simply to reflect some changes in state law. We also, outside of those requirements, made some changes to align requirements across permit types. And what I mean by that is there are kind of several agencies that have jurisdiction over water quality and soil erosion and sedimentation control. At the state level, you've got land quality and water quality. Land quality is where the land disturbance regulations are housed, the the Sedimentation Pollution Control Act. But water quality is who issues the permits so that construction sites may discharge their treated water back to the waters of the state. And so sometimes, even at the state level, some of the requirements vary. And one rule may say you can do things one way, and another rule lines out a more stringent requirement. And we've always had kind of a blanket statement in our ordinances that say the most stringent ordinances or requirements apply, rather than trying to just rely on that blanket statement. We try to just find the more stringent requirement in our ordinance in an attempt to minimize confusion. And the last kind of change type we had was removal of redundant or superfluous language in the ordinance. The ordinance, of course, has undergone many updates and changes since it was first adopted. And we tried with the UDO process to remove redundant references or requirements that were outlined in several locations throughout the ordinance. Next slide, please. This is a summary of changes. This is by no means a comprehensive list of a comprehensive summary of the changes, but it includes kind of some examples of some of the types of changes that were made. For anyone in the audience who's interested in a more complete list of what was changed, I'm happy to connect with you outside of this and explain in further detail. But some of the changes are: we added a sedimentation control buffer, which is in the Sedimentation Pollution Control Act and state law. We did not have that provision in our local ordinance. This shouldn't be confused with swim buffers or post-construction buffers. These are buffers that are intended as an alternative to other treatment methods that may provide adequate treatment to construction site stormwater discharges. There was no provision about fill material, the type of fill material that was used, and that's in the state law. We wanted to add that in. One of the most substantial changes really that were made to the ordinance was the change in the frequency of the rainfall triggered inspections. As of April of 2019, the state of North Carolina issued a new general permit for construction site stormwater discharges, that's soil erosion and sedimentation control, and they changed their rainfall triggered inspection frequency from half-inch event to a 1-inch event. In an attempt to normalize those requirements over permit types, this is the one place we kind of dialed back to what the state said with the 1-inch. And, anecdotally speaking, the half-inch events, seems like 25 years ago, we didn't see too many half-inch events. And it seems like, particularly the last few years, every event has been a half-inch event. So we're still, we've been by policy allowing folks to follow the permit conditions, the general permit conditions for the 1-inch rainfall inspections, and that still gives us a very good coverage. And so we were just going to continue with the 1-inch rainfall inspections. And that's in addition to a weekly inspection that is required on every site, no matter the weather. All right, next slide, please. About it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who presented. We will now kind of switch over to our question and answer section. Please, as I call these out, if you have additional questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat. I'm going to read each question, and then the subject matter expert for each of those will answer. We're going to start at the top. The very first question that we have came from Walter, and it says, does the term drainage features refer to public drainage features? I'm not sure if I can answer that.
All right, thank you, Walter. This is Robbie Zink. I would strongly suggest going through and reading that article. I used the term drainage features in the presentation really just to shorten it. Because I could have said pipes, catch basins, and ditches, and just went through all of it. I think the ordinance kind of defines it better. I will say that there's more strict type requirements are on public drainage facilities. So anything carrying public runoff or that has a city or a stormwater easement on it, there's, in regards to encroachments like that and into those there, that is more stringent. But the article does provide for or require, adequate and proper drainage on basically anything really. So.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Caleb. It says, are proprietary BMPs developed by an individual company or contractor allowed to treat stormwater in this new UDO? Are they limited and are they based on first come, first serve?
Hey, this is Jordan. I'll take this. And Yolanda, this will cover Jacob's question as well.
Thank you.
So the post-construction article will not define what you can do to comply when it comes to structural BMPs, but this stormwater BMP manual that is currently being updated will. And I will say there this valid question. It's going to be a big change there. So historically, you did have to have several positive studies, and we'll go into the details, but within our program, but we are moving to a less regulatory role in the pilot BMP monitoring sort of realm. And so we will be looking to accept the allowable BMPs at the state level in the SCM manual at the state, of which I believe there are 4 right now. So we're looking to move those into our SCM manual update. I will say they'll probably, or they will have some conditions that will need to be met locally that would be on top of kind of what the state requires, but they would be allowed with conditions would kind of be the easiest way to describe that. And then as far as Jacob's question kind of asked about the statewide NEST requirements. So since we're not going to be testing for regulatory allowance, we won't really be utilizing the NEST program locally. It'll be, if approved by the state, then the city could add it to our manual with whatever conditions were necessary to meet our kind of local requirements. Hopefully that answered both of those.
Thank you, Jordan. We do have a question from Carla, and it says Article 23, Polaris shows 50-foot lakeside buffers. Is the 100-foot a change from the 50?
No, and I think it's a similar question further on. Carla, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but no, there's no change. So for Lower Lake Wiley, it's a 50-foot low density buffer, but if you're high density, it kicks to 100. Polaris defaults to showing low density buffer requirements, regardless if you're on the lake or in the protected area. So if in the ordinance, it will stay the same, but on Polaris, it only shows the low density requirement. But low density remains 50 for Lower Lake Wiley and 100 for high density in Lower Lake Wiley. None of the buffer widths change with water supply rule.
And Jordan, I think this next question is for you from Carla, and I don't know if it was in reference to what you were just
the slide number,
but the slide number, but I'm not sure, Carla, if there's you know which one to cover.
Yep. So this is referring to, it's slide 35. Brendan, do you still have control? Awesome, thank you. So this is in reference to row 2 here. So our ordinance has historically required stormwater controls on redeveloped built upon area. A state law changed in late 2018 to basically disallow that on private property. So if you have a private property redevelopment that occurs, then you would not be required to provide increased stormwater controls on redeveloped built upon area. If it's public property, then you would still need to provide stormwater controls on redeveloped built upon area. So mostly that's city, county, CMS, trying to think of some others, but UNCC, I don't know, whoever is considered public land. So if you have a question on, like, if you have a development that may be sort of in a gray area, let us know. We can help you determine like where it falls. But the underscoring of private there was just to flag that it is the state law changes specific to private property, not public projects essentially.
Thank you. Todd asks, why did the city determine it necessary to retain both PCSO and SWIM? I would say SWIM, but I'm gonna call it as an acronym, buffers in the new ordinance rather than simplify with a single stream buffer requirement?
Yes, so Todd, we did look at that. The short answer is to provide the current amount of flexibility. We left them separate with the applicability and effective dates. In order to combine them, there was no real sweet spot of allowing folks to keep whatever property development rights they currently have into the new ordinance. So we left them separate, mainly for that reason. But happy to talk through it if you want after the fact. But essentially, it was to keep the applicability and flexibility kind of intact between the two.
Thank you. And Jordan, I'm going to read out Carla's question. Although you've answered it, I just want to be sure that it's heard on the playback. This is Article 23, 100-foot buffers. Is that a change from 50 foot as found on the charts linked to the environmental links at the bottom of a Polaris parcel search. Example, lower LWCA is listed as 50 and 100, but page 23-8 UDO says 100 foot and 100 foot. And I think you answered that, but I just be sure for the playback that people know what that question was. And then the last question, and again, if you have additional questions, please still feel free to put those in the chat. But the last question that we currently have in the chat is from Pam, and it says, have the business revitalization district and transit station area special districts in the old ordinance been removed from the new PCSO article?
Yes, Pam, that is correct. So the mitigation options that were referenced in the reference chart being removed were specifically tied to those areas. And so with the mitigation options being removed, the areas were necessary. They may remain in some other form for other departments' purposes, but from a post-construction perspective, the mitigation requirements go away. So we didn't need to reference them.
That is the end of the chat questions. What I'm going to ask now, Kate, if you would drop into the chat, there is an inbox that is available. I know folks who've been in these sessions before may have remembered this, but there is an inbox available for additional questions if you happen to have those after the session ends. You think of something you would like it answered. The inbox itself, the email inbox, is monitored Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 by our friends down in the Development Center, and they will get you the subject matter expert correct to answer your question. Also, I believe at the very end of this was a list of the contact information for the presenters for today. So if you feel like you want to direct, who should answer your question, you want to reach out directly, please feel free to do that. And again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. If not, we will wrap up today's session, and thank you all for attending. Just another second or so to see if we have any additional questions.
Just a reminder, our next session will be next Friday, where we'll be talking about parking, landscaping, and screening and open space. So again, remember, if you have not already registered, to go ahead and register. Doesn't look like we have any additional questions. Did we answer Caleb's Carpenter's question? Maybe I missed it at the top.
Yes, so I can actually, I'll read it out, Nan, but the question was answered in
Okay.
totality with Carla's question. But that, now that you say that, I would like to have it for the official record for playback. And it was, please describe any changes to the Innovation BMP evaluation program and or how the new statewide NEST requirements will be incorporated locally. And Jordan did answer that.
Okay, no, Caleb, I have Caleb's question is, are proprietary BMPs developed by an individual company, contractor allowed to treat stormwater in this new UDO? Are they limited and are based on a
Yes,
first
he answered. He did answer that.
Okay.
Yes, it was.
Okay, my
I'm
apologies.
sorry. No worries. It looks like we did have one more question come through from Anita. It says, if there is an increase of storm H2O or stormwater runoff, that's the first time I think I've seen it that way, stormwater runoff, when a single home is replaced by multifamily detached, leading to flooding, why are they approved?
All right, this is Robbie Zink. These are always difficult things, and they're difficult to answer in a way. One is not knowing how big the actual multifamily detached structures are. Under current ordinance, it has to be at least 20,000 square feet before they have to do any type of treatment or detention. And by state law, they don't have to detain for whatever existing home that is there currently. So that's one thing, that they may not have to do anything by our current ordinances and by state law. Under the UDO, we do change the trigger that which Jordan Miller talked about. We drop that down to 5,000 square feet. So lots more development will have to comply and will have to do some type of detention and or both water quality. So we're hoping the ordinance does help address those issues. But in general, a lot of the times when we see flooding, what people say is flooding is generally yard flooding. Every once in a while there's a structure, but by state law, downstream properties have to accept water from upstream properties, and that means developed properties. So it's natural that when something develops, that water does run downhill, and unfortunately it goes through people's yards, and they have to accept that. But we do try to, and we require them to meet current ordinances that when they are triggered, they do have to detain back to a pre-developed condition. I will say this time of year is the toughest a lot because the ground is so saturated, and so no water is being absorbed into the ground. The other thing that we see a lot is people do have water running through the yard naturally all the time, but they don't really notice it. But whenever construction occurs, no matter how good our erosion control is, turbid water does flow through people's yards, and you can see it. It's orange. That's the nature of living where we do and the soils that we have. You will see it. We can't control it. We control sediment the best we can. We can't make the water, drinking water, clear running through someone's yard. So it does, people do notice it. In this time of year, it's seems to be much worse. We get these questions a lot. So.
Thank you. And I think that is the last question that's come through. So again, thank you for being a part of our session today. The playback will be available on our YouTube channel. We try to have that within 48 business hours after the session ends. We will see you all in the next session.